Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Tasha McDougall, and I am with Visit Baltimore. And obviously, you just saw this fabulous video, and we are looking forward to welcoming the 2015 RAPS Regulatory Convergence Conference at the Baltimore Convention Center. So next year, in October 24th to 28th, you will be in our wonderful city. Our wonderful city has fabulous things to do, and the renowned Johns Hopkins University and Medical Center is located there in Baltimore, as well as the National Aquarium, which you saw some little spots from that, as well as our famous Inner Harbor. There are lots and many restaurants, shops, and things to do right located at the Inner Harbor, and the Convention Center is just steps away from that. So we look forward to hosting you in Baltimore in 2015, and hopefully everyone can attend. As you know, I sat at my table today, or yesterday and today, and received some business cards for our fabulous local hometown companies, and one, Matt is wearing is Under Armour, which is our fabulous company located in Locust Point. And then there is McCormick's Spices as well, and everyone knows about the crab in Maryland and Old Bay. So we love them as well. So we are going to go ahead and draw for this package, and it also includes an Apple gift card. So someone here today is going to be lucky to win that. So let's see. All right. Is Renee Olson here? Yay! Fabulous! She is with Thermo Fisher Scientific. Perfect. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Hi, how are you? There you go.
Please welcome to the stage RAPS Executive Director, Dr. Sherry Karamidas.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I know that we've had a fabulous 2.5 days, or for those of you that were here for the pre-conference workshops, a little bit longer. Austin has been terrific. We really look forward to welcoming you to Baltimore next year. We started out this conference talking about the opportunities and the complexities of the healthcare system. Today, we're also going to close by looking at the complexities and the opportunities in the regulatory sphere. And we're going to do that by looking at what it's going to take to build regulatory capacity around the world. And this is a really, really important time for all of you. We talked about what the health product sector has accomplished, its opportunities, and the challenges that lie ahead. And many of you were in sessions that talked about emerging technology and immediate needs. You saw examples of 3D printing that we talked about in the morning. You heard about mobile technology, and I understand that FDA today released its cybersecurity guidance. But we also talked about in that opening session about dealing with health crises and the Ebola outbreak originally in West Africa and now right here in the United States, and how health systems need to respond. So what is it about building regulatory capacity? I'm going to be joined this morning and actually sit back and listen to an amazingly expert panel of individuals who can share their rich experiences and their perspectives. And I'm very pleased to introduce them this morning. Immediately next to me is Mike Ward, and Mike is with Health Canada. He's been there for 24 years, came from health product industry, and while he's moved in various aspects of quality and regulatory in Health Canada, he now manages the international programs in the therapeutics division. But beyond that, Mike is involved in almost every global regulatory organization I can think of, from ICH to heading the APAC Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee to working with the WHO and PAHO. He has breadth and depth of knowledge that not only spans North America but around the world, and is learning firsthand about the challenges and the opportunities in helping drive regulatory capacity building. Next to him, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Martha Brumfield. Martha, who is now president-elect of the RAPS Board of Directors, also comes to us with a very, very wide background, initially with Pfizer for many years, where she was Senior Vice President of Worldwide Regulatory and Quality. Now President and CEO of the Critical Path Institute, involved in biomarkers and important new therapies. Martha was also one of the co-leaders of the Institute of Medicine panel that actually drove the Global Capacity Project, and she's still very instrumental in that regard. Martha continues to advise and work around the world on regulatory science, on regulatory convergence. And we're very pleased to have today Dr. Murray Mac Lumpkin. Many of you will remember him from his vast experience at the FDA. Through CEDAR and then in the Office of the Commissioner, Head of International Programs, and serving as the International Global Advisor to the Commissioner for many years. And now in his new capacity with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he is leading efforts to look at global capacity building and regulatory system development around the world. So he not only brings that wealth of experience that he gained at the FDA and his personal experience, but now looking at the efforts of many organizations reaching into the regulatory world. And we're also pleased to welcome from halfway around the world, Dr. John Lim. I had an opportunity to first meet John approximately a year ago through RAPS work in Singapore. John not only brings a rich medical background and a very rich background working with various agencies within the Singapore government, including the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. But when the HSA was formed in Singapore in 2001, he led their Center for Drug Evaluation and then became their chief executive, a position that I believe you served in for 8 years. John just stepped down from that role in July, but continues to head up medical services in the Ministry of Health and an important new role, heading a Center for Regulatory Excellence at the Duke NUS Postgraduate Medical School. So I can think of no greater panel of experts to share their expertise. I'm very honored to be able to sit here with them today. They're going to have a conversation, and I'd like them to begin to maybe start off by sharing from their perspective, what is regulatory capacity building? What is it going to take to build capacity not only in developed regulatory systems, but in low and middle income countries where they're trying to develop regulatory capacity and improve access to safe and effective health products. So Mike, we're going to just start with you and then ask each of you to jump in and share your perspectives.
Thanks very much, Sherry. This is an incredibly important question. It affects all of us. There's a lot going on right now globally. It's a very exciting time. I've been in international affairs for about 15 years now, and some of the opportunities that are presenting themselves we wouldn't have thought possible a number of years ago. What will it take? It will take a concerted effort to build regulatory capacity across our various jurisdictions. As I mentioned, a lot is taking place right now, but it's been happening somewhat in silos. And I think the need is so great to really build institutional capacity, but as part of that, the competencies of staff within regulatory agencies, and also in the other sectors, certainly industry and those involved in, for example, oversight of clinical trials. But it has to be really taking place in a more coordinated fashion. And just as one example, one of the things that I have the privilege of chairing is, as you mentioned, Sherry, is the APEC Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee. APEC stands for Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the health aspect of this is really that you have healthy people, you have healthy economies, but it also promotes trade and economic growth. And really harmonization and convergence on a regulatory level becomes very important to innovation, becomes very important to access and ensuring safe and efficacious products. What we have done from the ground up is really design something that complements other international activities such as ICH and IMDRF. So you have essentially standard development organizations creating guidances and standards at a technical level. But what we are doing is promoting a better understanding and use of these particular guidances and standards. ICH is now launching new guidance on multi-regional clinical trials. We just came from, and actually John will be able to perhaps say a word or two about this, a really exciting proof of concept in March at Duke NUS, National University of Singapore, with the involvement of regulatory authorities plus industry, looking at some of the challenges associated with the evaluation of multi-regional clinical trials. So you have, on the one hand, ICH that's developing regulatory guidance, but how do regulators, how do inspectors, how does industry really deal with this, the real issues when you get these multi-regional clinical trials? So there's a complementary action here, and that, from my perspective, is what we really need to focus according to a strategic global plan. And this, of course, is so essential because everything now is globalized from diseases, but technical standards, and really having this interconnectivity, which incidentally is a new word at the second to last International Conference on Drug Regulatory Affairs in Tallinn, Estonia. WHO has taken up, saying that really we need to start connecting the dots between all the harmonization initiatives and the major players and training organizations. And that is starting to happen. So I think certainly a concerted global effort according to a strategic plan, and of course having the right competencies. If I could also say that this international is not something that is on the periphery of what we do. It increasingly allows regulators to meet their mandate. And we've heard, and you've heard many times, how even the FDA can't do things alone. Just as many of the companies here are multinational, really we have to have the counterpart on the regulatory side because of the globalization of industry, supply chain integrity, but also the rapid and increasing pace of new technologies. And to do this effectively and to make sure that we are doing the best jobs that we can at the domestic level, we have to have these linkages between regulatory authorities. So this is, again, a very exciting time. We need the profession of regulatory affairs professionals. I know many of you have been involved in, trying to improve approaches and build competencies to get your products to the market, but I would say there's an exciting future here in terms of global regulatory policy and capacity building where we can tap into your expertise.
Martha, if you could share your expertise as well.
Well, maybe I'll start with sharing a little bit about what we experienced on the Institute of Medicine Committee. I know everyone on the panel is aware, we've had this conversation, but many of you in the audience may not be aware. When we undertook this project at the request of the US FDA, we decided that we needed to go to countries and hear directly from the regulators, but also from the folks in industry and academia, so multinational companies as well as local manufacturers in the various countries that we visited. We visited countries in Asia, in Africa, South America, and it was amazing how consistent the themes we heard were, in that there was concern about the workforce competencies, but not just technical competencies. I think what we heard was there was no feeling of professionalism among the regulatory staff within the health authorities. There was no feeling of this esprit de corps. What do we belong to? What do we believe in? What is our mission? What is our vision as regulators? So when the committee deliberated about the appropriate actions to take place, we looked at everything possible from setting up a regulatory college somewhere in the world, kind of like the War College in the United States, where we could bring folks from other countries and just kind of embed them in a university setting, to fellowships where we could take fellows from EMA, Health Canada, Singapore, embed them in some of these agencies and vice versa. But where we came out as the best place to start is really to find the competencies that these individuals need. And that is really the work that thanks to Sherry and RAPS, they've taken a huge lead, and we've really made a lot of progress on developing this competency framework. So I believe this is a starting point, and marrying the delivery of training against those competencies with many of the types of programs that Mike just described. But it can't stop with classroom learning. We do need to think about ways to really embed in some of the cultures some of the important principles of just ethics, professional responsibility, understanding what risk mitigation is about and how that gets applied. And I think we also have to recognize it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. As we all know, many countries have such limited staff in their regulatory agencies that they're not going to be able to encompass the enterprise-wide approach that an FDA or Health Canada or EMA would take in terms of designing a system. So we're going to need to think about how to allow flexibility and how applicable many of these training programs can be in the country so that we actually start to affect some change. I believe it's going to take many years. It's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but for many of you who are early in your careers, hopefully you'll be around to see the benefit downstream from many of these training initiatives that are going to be put in place. And to the point that Mike made, I think you all know probably better than most how global our work is today, and that we have to embed into everything we do the nuances of difference around the world and think through within our own organizations how we best accommodate what some of those needs are. And an example, I know in a company I came from, sometimes every year as regulatory professionals, we were evaluated on a number of approvals in various countries. And I understand we need metrics to measure performance, but maybe that's not the best metric to be thinking about. Maybe it needs to be thought about as approval in the context of what the healthcare system can really handle for that particular type of product. And maybe later Mac and I can share with you some examples that we've been dealing with recently with some neglected diseases. So I just think there's a huge role for regulatory professionals to play, and I encourage you not to just sit back and think, oh, that decision belongs in another department. Try to embrace a global perspective and look at the entire process from A to Z, not just discovery, development, getting through regulatory approval, but how actually will that product be utilized in the healthcare setting where we'll be placing our products in the future. So I just wanted to share that perspective and hope that will be helpful to you.
Thank you. Mac, I think you have a very unusual perspective coming from the largest regulatory agency in the world and often considered a model for others, and now working with the Gates Foundation, looking at small countries that are just trying to develop regulatory capacity. Mm-hmm. Are there going to be mini FDAs? So why don't you share your perspectives?
No, I think you bring up, which for us is one of the fundamental challenges when we talk about regulatory capacity building, and when people come to us and say, are you willing to support regulatory capacity building in country A, B, or C? And the countries with whom we deal, really the low and middle income regulatory agencies, I think we see in them the real question when you talk about regulatory capacity building is what regulatory capacity building in what sense? I think, in the short term, in the medium term, and maybe even really in the long term, the reality of creating little FDAs or little EMAs or little Health Canadas or little HSAs all around the world is probably not what's going to happen and probably really not what's needed to happen. And if you kind of back away from that as the expectation of capacity building, then it begs the question, okay, what capacities? And I think when we look at a lot of the low and middle income countries who are extremely resource limited, extremely experience limited, they do have some very fundamental questions and some very fundamental capacities that they tell us they would like to develop. And one of these, for example, is how do you figure out within your own jurisdiction what your major public health issues are that you as a regulatory agency need to focus on for your jurisdiction? I mean, that's a capacity that people need to be able to do to kind of figure out what they can do and where their biggest problems really lie. The second capacity is then, well, once you figure that out, given the resources you have, how do you prioritize those resources? To really figure out, well, if I've only got a certain amount and these are my major healthcare priorities, where do I need to prioritize them to do things that really nobody else can do? And some of those things, for example, tend to come out like local pharmacovigilance. That's really not something anybody else can do for you within your own jurisdiction. Issues of supply chain integrity and dealing with counterfeits within your borders and substandard products within your borders are tremendous problems for the countries with whom we work, and that is a capacity to try to figure out how do you begin to approach these kinds of issues. And when you think about this, we haven't even talked about INDs or NDAs or reviewing applications. These are other kinds of capacities that really begin to address some of the major public health issues that they have. And then the third capacity is, well, if this is where your local resources are going to go, how do I figure out how to do these other things? The marketing applications, the clinical trials that people now want to do in my country. How can I be part of the larger global regulatory enterprise and rely on and leverage what others are doing, other trusted agencies are doing, that then allow me to make more informed decisions and better decisions for what's going to be happening in my country? And I think what we're beginning to see in these countries are that the products they're dealing with really kind of fall into three buckets. They're the standard products for the standard illnesses that we all have as human beings, the diabetes products, the hypertension products, these kinds of things which are on their market and which they have a huge problems with counterfeits and substandards. And how do you deal with that issue? Then you've got products that are coming in for neglected diseases, which are going to be used in many parts of the world. How do you fit into that? And then, as Martha was saying, some of the ones that are really most difficult are, what if there's a product that really is only going to affect diseases that are endemic in your country and, say, a few of your neighbors, and there's not going to be experience in the rest of the world with it? How do you begin to approach that from a regulatory, from a scientific, from a pharmacovigilance perspective to really do right by the public health and the population within your country that you are supposed to be helping and facilitating and protecting? So that just, I hope, gives you an idea of some of the challenges in the low and middle income countries when we talk about capacity building. Clearly they're interested in ICH guidances, they're interested in a lot of the things that happen in high income country regulatory authorities, but their realities are really somewhat different. And as we think through the capacities that we need to help build, I think we need to think about it in the context of where their challenges are versus kind of where the challenges are with others in the regulatory enterprise.
And John, you represent a very small country, a very fairly young regulatory agency that has tried to be quite innovative in developing its systems. It was interesting as I met in some of the IOM follow-up panel meetings and met regulators from around the world, and they often said Singapore is a role model. They're innovative, they get it done. But why don't you share some of your perspectives about how Singapore has been able to do this and how this might apply to other nations around the world?
Well, thanks, Sherry. I think as we think of this issue of regulatory capacity, we're looking really at skills and systems. So if I can share something from the experience of what we've gone through, not just in Singapore, but in Southeast Asia, if we look at the first issue of skills, way back 9 years ago, we were talking with the WHO in those days, and we were working with Indonesia and Malaysia to try and come up with a kind of skills curriculum. And here we were looking just at regulatory agencies within Southeast Asia, within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. And so we had a curriculum drawn up, but we couldn't really implement it. We had a kind of idea that we could ride on the academic institutions across Southeast Asia to train the regulatory agencies, but I think given our smallness, not just Singapore, but in fact, if you look at the regulatory agencies around Southeast Asia, we're all pretty small in size, given the kind of work that has to be done. And there was no opportunity to sort of advance that. And so if we fast forward to the present, when RAPS came into the picture, we felt that we then needed to sort of set up a center which would be looking at capacity building of the right sorts of skill sets. And in fact, RAPS has already set up a program at the National University of Singapore to develop professionals, regulatory professionals in the medical device area, because that's a fast booming area. The whole medtech industry is just really developing at an extraordinary rate, even within the Asian scene itself and in Singapore. And then beyond that, we were saying, where do people, or how do they develop? And the sense was, when the Singapore Economic Development Board was talking with companies and industry, they were saying that even the marketing and sales professionals in industry were a bit hampered by the fact that they really hadn't sort of got the training and the skills they needed to look at the whole regulatory affairs issue. And so this is where the idea of this Center of Regulatory Excellence at the Duke NUS Graduate Medical School has come from, where we're now trying to look at mid to senior people, both from industry, from companies, as well as regulatory agencies. And we're looking, of course, at issues like skills, but we're thinking of going further than that. It's also the mindset, and that flows into that second broad bucket of systems, because there needs to be a kind of platform where people are looking at the systems within their countries and pushing the boundaries of innovation, because as my fellow panelists have said, even with the US FDA, I mean, the FDA says there are not enough people, and yet if you look at the numbers of people in the FDA compared to, let's say, what we have in Singapore, it's this vast difference, and everyone is saying the same thing, we don't have enough. And so if you're just going to depend on numbers of people and skills, it's not going to solve the capacity issue. The systems have to be looked at. But just picking up a point that Mike raised before I go further into the systems issue. So what we did earlier this year, in fact, even before this center was set up, we worked with Mike's Regional Harmonization Steering Committee in APEC to develop a kind of program just for the regulators around the Asia-Pacific, and 19 of the 21 economies came, and we leveraged on the Duke NUS e-learning platform, and Justina Molzone from the FDA she got together a very good faculty of people from industry, but a lot of them had experience in the FDA. There was, of course, a biostatistician from Health Canada. I must mention Health Canada as well. And they put together a program where the industry representatives put together a dossier, a mock dossier on a statin. And we used the e-learning platform of Duke NUS to prepare the representatives from the regulatory agencies, and then brought them together after their own study at their own time into Singapore for about a few days of a workshop-based setting where the faculty were then there. And that's a very interesting model, because that's probably one way where we're looking at specific issues and skills that need to be developed, and we can then leverage on technology and academic platforms that can then begin to address broad areas of need. But then just quickly moving on to the second bit, the systems, and Mac was touching on this. This is again something we looked at many years ago. Although we're young, Sherry, I mean, we have been around for a decade or more, 14 years in HSA, and we were looking at this whole issue of referencing, because that is one of the issues which will help to address the fact that no agency will ever have enough people. And I would say even within companies, you may not have enough people really for the kind of work that is developing nowadays. And so if you have this referencing of trusted agencies, if people are coming together to pool decision making, and you don't have every agency trying to become like a mini FDA or a mini EMA, that's one way where we can address the resource numbers issue and also leverage on capacity so that we can work in a smarter way to address issues not just within the region but also globally as well. And these are kind of models we've developed within the HSA, and we're looking within how we can promote this further within East Asia, within Southeast Asia. And I think MAC is interested through the Gates Foundation to then see how it can be extended to areas in Africa and areas like the Middle East and so on and so forth. And so I think these are very broadly issues of capacity, and just throwing some ideas into the ring about how we might begin to address them in a way to sort of solve all these many, many challenges that we face.
You mentioned about relying on trusted regulatory agencies, and certainly there are a number of very trusted regulatory agencies, some of them very large and complex. And I guess my question would be, do smaller developing regulatory systems or countries with very immature regulatory systems understand those agencies, understand how to communicate with them? You can't develop trust unless you have knowledge and some kind of communication. Is this an issue, or how do we address this issue moving forward?
It certainly is an issue, and we as regulators now have a different audience. It's not just the sponsors and patients groups within our own jurisdictions. Now the new audience is other regulatory authorities. And we can't expect them just to take at face value, that you can trust us. We have to be, as agencies, more transparent. So we put either summaries or redacted versions of our assessments up on the website. So really transparency of agencies, looking at also promoting a better understanding of how we approach the review process. For years, Justina Molzon, John mentioned, has been conducting CEDAR forums. So every year, regulators coming together and looking at case studies, how the FDA actually reviews and comes to a decision on a product. And I think, and Mac, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but even the WHO is saying that there's a bridge processes for pre-qualification programs where trusted, recognized authorities, if you've reviewed it, well, then it's a fast track onto the pre-qualification list. But if you aren't transparent about, putting out a summary of how you came about this, your assessment of this, like the WHO does with the HUPARs, the public assessment reports, there is a need to really, firstly, be transparent, but also say and explain to other agencies now that increasingly would want to take advantage of either WHO assessments or the assessments of other regulatory authorities. So I think the aspect of transparency between regulatory authorities and really explaining how we do our business so that those agencies that really don't have the resources or capacity to undertake a review of a new chemical entity or new molecular entity, they can better spend their time on market control, on vigilance, looking at what is most important, but to be able to take full advantage and have confidence in the decisions of other agencies, it's only realistic to expect that they want to understand this a little better and to perhaps work with other agencies. And I know that there are, Mac, you were mentioning last night that even Article 58 in the EU legislation is being looked at, and how really we have a duty as the better resourced agencies to really work with our fellow colleagues in agencies that have really resource constraint.
I think, though, it's important when we talk about this that people understand when we talk about reliance on the work products of other agencies, we're not talking about a blind recognition. We're not talking about just rubber stamping what EMA does or rubber stamping what FDA does. WHO does not do that, for example, when what Mike is talking about when a product has been authorized by what they call a stringent regulatory authority, they clearly use the work products from that agency. They use the analyses, the scientific analyses. They use the inspection reports. They use the work products to inform their decision. But they do look at their decision within the context of the countries for whom this product is going to be purchased by UN agencies. Is the stability correct? Was it done in a way that the product will remain stable? Can it be transported, given the realities of transport in the country where it's going for? Is it labeled in a way that it makes sense that you can use it in that medical setting the way clearly it could be used in a high-income kind of setting? So they're what they call these country suitability analyses that they do to make sure that if the scientific analysis that came out of a stringent regulatory authority and the inspection report that came out makes sense, then they will go ahead and not repeat that or do it in a redundant way. And I think when we talk about reliance, as John said, we're talking about really on how do you best use your resources, and doing things that are redundant simply for the sake of doing them obviously doesn't make any sense. But you have to look at it and say, where do you add value to the overall decision-making process? And I think what WHO looks at when they do pre-qualification of products that have gone through SRAs is look at this country suitability, these kinds of questions, and that's where they add their value. Another point to where I think you were going, Sherry, on kind of how do you get buy-in and how do you get trust in using that information to make your own decision. And some of the things that we are finding helpful and that we are supporting in many different areas around the world is trying to figure out, particularly, for example, with WHO, they have a program now where it's called their collaborative review process. It's on their website. The countries that have joined it are there. The terms of reference are up on their website. But it's a process whereby if a product has been pre-qualified and the company wishes to then market that product in country A, B, or C, if those countries have signed up with this particular process, then WHO is allowed to send their inspection reports, they're allowed to send their analyses, and they're allowed to work with the country, and the country agrees to make a decision within 90 days. And thus far, they've actually done this for the great majority of products that have gone through this relatively new process. But I think what we're finding and what WHO is finding is that if there are ways that you can bring these regulators into the decision-making process, whether it's into the pre-qualification process, if it's into the Article 58 process, whatever, if there's a way to bring them to the table so that they are part of the discussion, they hear to the discussion, they clearly learn from the discussion, but they also contribute to the discussion. And particularly these issues of country suitability and things that are going to be critical if that product's going to be able to be used safely within their jurisdiction and within their healthcare system. Once they're at the table and then, say, WHO makes a decision or CHMP makes a decision, then it's much easier for them to take it into their own regulatory system and make their own decision because they've been part of the discussion. They've been part of the overall process. And so I think this kind of, as you say, connecting the dots and amalgamating, particularly on these critical new products for neglected diseases that need the scientific expertise that you find in the SRAs, but also need the benefit of those in the countries where it's going to be used to figure out how you really use it best in those countries, and to bring that perspective that only they can bring to the table is really a way that we see that a lot of these are going.
Mm-hmm. Can I just raise, one of you mentioned the area of trust between regulatory authorities, and I think what you're talking about is the differences between sort of the stringent authorities and low and middle income countries, but I even think of what FDA, EMA, Health Canada, TGA, Swissmedic have been going through. They've been doing some pilot joint inspections, both GMP inspections as well as GCP inspections. And, on first blush, you think, well, gosh, this is pretty simple. Why can't they just accept what each other is doing? But, even at that type of agency, the way one often looks at a product or the concerns one agency has over another, there can be quite a bit of variation. Now, I do think with this continued effort on not only sharing inspection reports, but actually going to facilities doing joint inspections, I think in time this is going to relieve some of the resource burden for inspecting products that are manufactured all over the globe, because no one agency can ever do this. So if you think about what the stringent regulatory authorities are going through to build that trust, it's probably a factor of 10 to the 6 for what needs to be done with some of the lower and middle income countries that don't necessarily have that foundation from which they're even entering the conversation. I remember many of the countries we spoke with, the regulators, we're talking about wanting to be a part of ICH and setting standards. And they feel that they're never invited to the table, and therefore they become just a standard taker. They never have input into, could be stability standards, could be any type of standard, and how it actually is going to play out in real world setting in their country. So there just are, there's an incredible amount of variation in what all these different regulators can contribute, but we do need to go with the principle, rising tide floats all boats. I'm a strong believer in that principle.
But if I could jump in, I think I'm quite optimistic, because as we were having a conversation last night, so we didn't come in cold to this thing this morning, but I think the point was there is a great sense nowadays, compared to maybe a decade ago, of this real need for convergence and sharing. And if you look at regulators, certainly Commissioner Hamburg from the FDA, when she promoted this idea of this international coalition of medicines regulatory agencies, which is slowly taking shape, to look at a strategic level of coordination across agencies so that all the various efforts are being coordinated in a better way and you're better leveraging on the kind of decisions made. I think this is not a mindset that was necessarily there a decade ago, or even maybe 7, 8 years ago. But nowadays, I think because the pressures are so great, the resource constraints are so significant, and the technological challenges are significant, everyone is a lot more open to this, both from the regulatory side of the house as well as the industry side of the house. But having said that, picking up on a point that Martha made, when we begin to try and do work sharing, it's not necessarily so simple, because, as Sherry was highlighting, trust needs to be built up. Again, the WHO had a program many years ago where smaller agencies from developing countries would visit one another and sort of point out the gaps and in a very non-confrontational way highlight things and areas that needed to be developed. But we also had a small consortium with Health Canada. Singapore had a consortium with Health Canada, with TGA and Swissmedic. And when we tried to do work sharing there, we realized the intent actually is there. People recognize the need for it. But this whole issue that Mac raised of understanding the context and the culture needs to be addressed. And it does need some time to develop. Part of it is a very simple one of language. So sometimes if you have sort of reports in languages other than English, it's not so simple for that to be shared. But I was very heartened when I was in Japan at the 10th anniversary of the PMDA in February this year. The PMDA was very specific on the fact that they were going to make a specific effort to translate the reports, which would then make it much easier for sharing and this referencing that we were talking about earlier. But I think the point is there needs to be a lot of effort put into it. There needs to be support from both the regulatory side of the house, the industry side of the house, and academia has to come in to help this, to move it forward. But bottom line is, I'm pretty optimistic. Things are beginning to move. The challenges are there. But I think with a mindset, we can begin to solve these problems in a more practical and substantial way going forward.
No, go ahead.
If I could just pick up on what John was saying. So we have this consortium, this work-sharing consortium of 4 countries, Singapore, Australia, Switzerland, and Canada. And right now, I think we're really most advanced in the area of generic drug review. And why generic drug review? because every country in the world is suffering under tremendous workload pressures because of this, and also some of the challenges with globalization are most acute in this area, and even some of the things drugs that we never thought would be genericized are now, and how do we deal with this from a regulatory perspective. But we start here, and the thought is if we can build this business case and get it going in the area of generic drugs, really working through the mechanics of this, then that can be expanded and is starting to expand into other areas such as new drugs. But just to pick up on the point that John made, you can't underestimate the difficulties associated with what you would think are simple things, even identifying the same product in different jurisdictions, exchanging reports in a secure way in a timely manner. The issue of confidentiality, confidential business information, the hurdles not only imposed by laws and regulations, but the interpretation of legal counsel in various jurisdictions, IT portal issues, and then this is based on saying, okay, on the generic drug side for these countries, we have the underlay of the ICH quality guidances. Should be no big deal then. But then how do you actually review? And so we've taken case studies, we've done staff exchanges to really build up an operational policy that you will never see on a website. But how do you specifically review this? Oh, well, you're doing it that way. Well, that's interesting, and kind of mapping out the differences and similarities, and at the same time building up confidence. What I could say, though, is that we can't accept the status quo. I spoke recently to the director of our generic program, and she was saying how we're just drowning under all these applications. The day before, I had the same conversation with the TGA in Australia with her counterpart saying the same thing. So, as challenging as it might seem, the status quo is not an option. And 5 years, 10 years from now, we won't be having this discussion. We have to pool our resources in a strategic manner. And I think this is a good indication. Now, that consortium of 4 countries now has expanded, and we have the International Generic Drug Regulators pilot, which involves the major players around the world. And so this is very exciting, and I think a pioneer in the area of drugs. Coming back just briefly to,
No, please.
I was just going to say to Martha's point about inspections, and of course this is a topic that has been raised many times in the past, and you were talking about GCP and GMP. Mm-hmm. And maybe we've been focusing in this discussion to date a lot on drugs. But I think one of the most exciting developments here is the single audit program. So the medical device single audit program, where you had 4 agencies that came together with a common vision. So that's the US, Canada, Australia, and Brazil, with Japan as observers, saying, you know, maybe there's a smarter way of doing this. Instead of having all this multiplicity of audits against quality management systems, maybe we can do it once, but by the way, we won't do it because we don't have the resources. We'll really base our decisions on the audits conducted by third parties. So whether you call them notified bodies, registrars, different names, but they're the same auditing organizations, we will recognize them. They will follow a rigorous process. And that way, we use our regulatory resources in a more efficient manner. So we oversee and help build a system that they then execute with the vast resources that globally the auditing organizations will have. And then if you have this consortium of countries that are doing this according to international standards, we are also looking at developing a global repository that would have access levels by other regulatory authorities. And so they, again, would have confidence in the results conducted by these third parties overseen by these stringent regulatory authorities. So we're very excited about this. It's moving ahead quickly, as many of you know. And I think this is smarter global regulation.
I was just going to say, you know, we've talked about kind of two different groups of trusting. And most recently here, it's been between the high-income countries and the challenges between the high-income countries. And I think, as John said a few minutes ago, one of the kind of impenetrable variables in all of this discussion is the culture issue. And one of the real culture issues that I think between the high-income countries that you have to put on the table is the reality that kind of at the kind of iterative level, as Mike says, it doesn't make any sense that we don't trust each other. I mean, just think between the U.S. and Canada. We all go to Canada and eat and don't think twice about it. They come here and eat and don't think twice about it. If I got sick in Toronto and had a prescription, I would go to a pharmacy in Toronto, get the drugs, not think twice about it. And I hope Mike would feel the same way if he got sick here in Austin. So kind of, at the personal level, we've already done the trust thing because we're making personal decisions on what we eat and whether we would buy products in the pharmacies in the various countries. But kind of at the agency level, I think what has always driven the hesitancy to get to that point is the reality of saying as long as everything goes okay, there is no problem. But when something goes wrong and you've relied on somebody else, they're not going to call Mike down there and say, what went on. They're going to call somebody from within that jurisdiction and say, why did you trust them? Now we've had this problem. You relied on them. And saying, well, because I would buy drugs in Toronto is probably not an answer that's going to get very far. So what you've seen, I think, by default is this kind of due diligence effort to try to be able to answer that question when it happens, and it will. That something will go wrong, and you've got to be able to answer back honestly. Well, this is why I trusted them, because we did this, 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 and this, and guess what? It probably would have gone wrong in our system, too. Mm-hmm. And, the reason I trust them is not because they're 100% right. We're not 100% right. But because when there's a problem, they tell us, they've done things, they're going by international standards, they have laws, they enforce laws, they're not corrupt. I mean, you can kind of go through the due diligence. But I think what the challenge is, Mike, is that we're really good at continuing to do due diligence. But it's when do we stop confidence building and say we have confidence? It always seems, in the 25 years, thinking back in the early, start of ICA, we were going to build confidence. It's been 20 years. At what point do you say we've done our due diligence? We now have confidence in so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, and now we're going to get on using the fact that we have confidence. And I think that's really one of the challenges of getting from developing confidence to having confidence.
And some of that, in my mind, comes down to risk sharing. Mm-hmm. I think certainly in this country and in other countries, there's an expectation when a product goes on the market, it's absolutely safe. And I think we need to do a better job about talking about the whole framework of product development. That, yes, we can make sure it's absolutely safe, but it might take 25 years for it to get through a review with all the inspections we need to do. So I don't know how to frame this conversation, but I feel very strongly that the patients, the prescribers, the developers, the regulators, and the payers, the procurers, need to be in that dialogue and understand that sometimes we don't need perfection, that if it's good enough, I know I used to say to my staff a lot, C+ on this project is good enough. You don't need the A+ for this particular activity. Now, certainly there are times when you do, but I sometimes feel that we have set the bar too high by raising our own expectations.
But I think part of this I think I agree with Martha. It's really communication you're beginning to talk about. I think the concern, though, which Mac was alluding to, was how do you address the kind of distinctive societal issues? And within every society, the risk threshold shifts over time, depending on what happens. So if you've got no adverse event, then after a while people say, well, you're too strict. And then after a while, when something happens, they say you're too lax. But the trouble is it's not happening uniformly around the world. It's sort of adverse events can occur in different settings. And I think the great challenge is how do we bring all these issues that Martha was highlighting into a more global platform for more effective global communication. Because I think any government, I mean, no matter how trusted the regulator is, if anything happens, it's the politician that has to face the sort of wrath of the public. Generally then, of course, you can have the regulator being the scapegoat or whoever, even the company being the scapegoat. But the thing is, if there's a lot more consolidation of this risk awareness and more consolidation of the communication messages and maybe better platforms to convey this. So I think something like this new international coalition that's developing could be one way to do this. I think this would be one way to address it. Otherwise, all that we've been saying about referencing, sharing, work sharing will still come to naught when major issues happen. And inevitably they will happen. I mean, we have to be realistic about that. So I think we really have to begin to address that more. But again, I think these platforms are beginning to develop. Some are already more solid than others. But there is a kind of, well, this is the regulatory convergence, right, that we talk about, where people are beginning to see things in the same way. And now we have to build the systems and the platforms to really address this whole risk communication issue and explain it more effectively. And again, I think Mac's point of cultural differentiation has to be addressed, because whatever you address in the US in terms of risk may not necessarily be what the Chinese population or the Japanese population or the Indian population thinks about. So I think there has to be a new skill set developed there in terms of sort of focusing those issues and contextualizing it into the specific cultures.
And if I could just talk about one different culture that maybe we haven't touched on in depth right now, and that it is within an agency. And Mac, you were saying, when do we stop the confidence building and get on with it? And I think the people here, we're preaching to the converted, and it is the way to go. There's no question about this. So you have to invest in international affairs. You have to have a realistic goal and move towards that. You have to have the support of the senior executive within this agency, and they have to send the signal within that agency that the times they are changing. And I can't speak for other agencies, but I think it's probably the same. If we look at inspection, we look at assessment or evaluation, you have a conservative community. And adapting to change isn't something that's maybe top in their job description. And so even if we invest in all of this activity at an international level, and the people that are involved in this say, man, we have confidence in Australia or US or whatever agency that we're working with, then you come back and you have to integrate that in a changing paradigm within your agency. And those that have not been intimately involved, how well do you describe that? How do you really deal with change management to say, listen, and by the way, we're not going to get rid of your job, but the way you will do your job, the way you will satisfy the regulations to ensure that the products are safe and efficacious is going to be changing, and you're going to have actually exciting opportunities to be work sharing or exchanging information with your counterparts. So what we found is that you can't just invest at the international level. There has to be a good infrastructure for this within respective agencies to make this business as usual. And that is where we're seeing right now perhaps the greatest challenge. It's kind of a progression where you're working through this, saying we have the same standards, let's look at our approaches, let's see where we're similar or different. So if you're different there, that's good. When we get your review report, we'll take that into account in making a more efficient internal review process using your reports. But it's really that change management within agencies that we can't underestimate.
You know, before we get too far into it, I think there's another party in this whole thing that we haven't addressed quite as much, and that's the role of the manufacturers in this entire enterprise. Because I think those of us on the regulatory side, you very frequently hear from industry, well, you know, if the FDA has done it or if the EMA has done it, why can't so-and-so accept it? And, you know, one thing we find, and maybe this is more true in the low and middle income countries than perhaps between the high income countries, but often it's not the same product. You know, it doesn't come from the same line. It often doesn't even come from the same plant. And yet, you know, it's, well, you should take it because the FDA has inspected it. And you start looking and you find out, no, the FDA hasn't inspected it. The FDA inspected a totally different plant. And now you're sending the product, the same product, that's manufactured elsewhere. And so, you know, I think at some point, if you all are beginning to put together your global marketing plans and you're thinking about how you're going to take your products overseas, this is an issue that has to be addressed up front, is are you really marketing the same product so that people can rely on the work that others have done, or are you really not marketing the same product? And in that case, for whatever reason, if that's your business model, if that's what you need to do, then I think you have to be realistic as to what that means in terms of whether people can rely or not rely on each other. Because that's become an issue as we've looked at it. And I think part of the problem, particularly in low and middle income countries, and we have to be very honest about this, I mean, you've got high income countries up here, but one of the things about fooling with a regulator from a high-income country is, you know, if something goes wrong in that relationship, there are consequences. You know, if there's a manufacturing problem, if there's a safety problem, you'll have consequences in Singapore, you'll have consequences in Canada, you'll have consequences here in the United States. That's not always true in most low and middle income countries. You know, what are the consequences of sending product in that comes off of a line where something has gone wrong and you've not reported it? There really aren't a lot of consequences. And many manufacturers around the world realize that there are not, at this point in time, a lot of consequences and behave, unfortunately, because of that knowledge. And I think that, again, that's one of our challenges if we're going to be part of the global regulatory community, and if there is more of the expectation of reliance on each other and sharing, we've got to know we've got the same product and that the consequences are going to be the same, whether you're in Canada or the U.S., Singapore, or in a low-income country.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really good lead-in into an issue that I wanted to bring up with all of you, and that's the concept of how do we build a regulatory profession globally. We've talked about the global context, the local context. We've talked about the soft skills. We've talked about the roles of the regulator versus industry. But if we start thinking about this as a profession that practices in different settings, can we begin to leverage on those shared knowledge, skills, and competencies to come together and really address issues like differences in what's being sent to different countries? Can we come together to look at the change paradigms, how they affect the manufacturer, how they affect the regulator and other organizations? So while we're shifting in this very dynamic environment, do we also need to leverage a profession that is sitting in many different areas?
And that's an excellent segue to something that you're intimately involved in, Sherry, and that is the global competencies and regulatory curriculum, which is very exciting, really coming out of the Institute of Medicine report. And one of the major findings that, you know, you can undertake a lot of training, but from our experience, has it been effective? And it can only be optimally effective if you're training people who have the right competencies and skill sets, both in industry and in regulatory agencies to begin with. Even what is a competency? What is a core competency? What is a functional competency? What is a technical competency? There's no international standard for this. And I think the Institute of Medicine recommendations that were coming out were saying that, in fact, we do need this. And why should good soft people skills be important in one jurisdiction but not another? And some of the core things like effective communication and some fundamental functional competencies, although this initiative, which is going to be handed over to the WHO, is looking at low and middle income countries, the regulators in low and middle income countries. We just had a session, what was it, about 3 weeks ago in Washington, in Rockville, where 20 or so experts from foods, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals came together after a rigorous assessment process to distill down and refine what these competencies should be. And we're focusing on entry level, and after 2 years, this is what the individual should have. But in talking about this, we were saying, well, this is not unique for low and middle income. Every regulatory agency in the world should have this. And so this is going to be an incredibly important endeavor to define these regulatory competencies so that we're all consistent and that institutional development plans are taking this into consideration and that we then train against this. And so there are differences. So this is, I think, where RAPS and the regulatory affairs can play a really exciting role in contributing to this exercise on the development, on the implementation side, but really to have optimal benefit from training and capacity building, you really have to start with defining what the competencies you need in a regulatory agency or as a sponsor, and building against that. Otherwise, really, we've seen a lot of wasted effort.
But it's interesting that you bring that up, and these are minimum competencies, as you said. So as you begin a regulatory career, you mentioned the challenges of change management. You mentioned the changing paradigms that we're seeing. Martha, you mentioned the desire of regulators around the world to engage in the standard-setting process. We're not talking about minimum competency, so there has to be a commitment to further development and to allow them to grow and engage in those processes. So it may be that we're talking about a huge thrust to help carry the profession in across borders, appropriately to build these kinds of issues. Is that going to be possible?
I'm an optimist, so I think it is possible. Again, I think it's a long road, but every journey starts with the first step, and I think that's where we are today. I think we should be creative in looking at other opportunities. Perhaps at least one way of learning that I've always found very effective, particularly in the softer skills, like how to adapt to change, leadership, communication skills, is to do case studies. Get people together in a room and have them just, do the hard work of role-playing or figuring out what is the strategy I would put in place, how will I execute on this strategy. So I think with a number of the challenges that we're facing with the need for new regulatory pathways or review criteria, think about the 3D printing, right? That's going to become a reality for us, and I don't think any of us have the confidence we know what we need to maneuver to bring a product of that nature to market, at least in the healthcare setting. So is that an opportunity to form maybe a task force of some regulators and industry professionals from around the world and throw them in a room for 2 days and have them go at it? So I think we need to come at it from multiple ways. Training is not, it's very effective. It's not the only way that people learn. And certainly from my experience, being able to apply what I've learned by being forced into a situation where I just have to find my way forward. It's uncomfortable, but that's how we learn, that's how we grow, is being willing to sort of step outside our comfort zone. So I really believe we just need to look for other opportunities to complement, the work that you're doing in developing the competencies and how we roll those out. But I'm sure maybe you guys have other ideas.
Well, I think building on what Martha said, which is partly why the ethos of this new center that I'm now heading is tackling it in a sense from bottom up and top down. So the bottom up bit is where you're looking at the kind of more basic essential things that you need. And even then, actually the question in my mind was, between drugs, devices, and all the new technologies, are there opportunities there? Because maybe with the newer technologies, there are fewer legacy issues, and people are able to come together on a more level playing field to address these competency issues earlier. But then picking up on what you're saying, Martha, I think the thing is you do need to bring together people in the room to really look at these things from a sort of higher order. And one of the things that my center is planning to do is to have more closed-door sessions to look at specific issues, sensitive issues, issues of challenge, and to bring together senior people from across the divide so that we have industry, regulators, and even academics in the room, but with minimum publicity. Because I think the point is whenever people are in a very public situation and you're forced to defend situations and explain, sometimes you're pushed against a wall and you have to just hold certain positions. Whereas if you're in a kind of more closed-door setting with Chatham House rules, with non-attribution, one actually can potentially get to the sort of root of the issues and find solutions because it's less threatening. It sounds a bit idealistic, but certainly the feedback we're getting is there's tremendous excitement to organize these kind of sessions, and I think they've been held sporadically in different places around the world. And I think if we have more of these sorts of settings, we might be able to begin to address some of these challenges, define the systems, skills, issues, and some resolution, so it's not just a lot of talking, but to actually begin to find solutions to them. And then, as you're saying, it's an ownership issue, because everyone owns the solution at the end of the day, and you're looking at it more globally. So I think that's another perspective on how we can begin to address and enhance the whole professionalism and the resolution to issues we're facing nowadays.
The only thing I would add is, again, kind of going back to the low and middle income world that I'm facing now, is I would think that when we talk about these kinds of raising competencies, that it's not just the competencies of the agencies, but it's also the competencies of the regulatory affairs professionals. And in the world, particularly of low-income countries, it's just such a different paradigm for what the products have to go through to be registered, what they have to go through to be bought, the dealing with what we call procurers, whether your product is going to be bought by the Global Fund and distributed by them, by Unitaid, by UNICEF, what kind of quality assurance are they asking for? Does the ministry have an extremely limited budget, and therefore it's almost like an HTA situation where they're having to figure out how they're going to pick this version of a product or that version of a product or this version? It's a very different market. It's a very different post-market. And, in the times where the people with whom we've worked, both on the regulatory side and the manufacturing side, the regulatory affairs professional is this incredible linchpin. If you've got a really good, knowledgeable regulatory affairs professional who understands and can not only work in that environment, but can explain it to their company and explain why it is different and what you can use from your high-income experience and what is unique. And I think what we're finding is, as all of you know, I mean, many of these, even the low-income countries, these are some of the fastest growing economies in the world. There is great poverty, but there is also great riches in many ways. These are going to be the future of markets and market growth around the world. So we're seeing great interest in multinationals and in others who have not traditionally been interested in these markets because they realize 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, these are going to be what the Chinas and Indias were. They are now what they were 10 and 15 and 20 years ago. And you're going to see incredible growth, both economically and in potential. So, being on the front end of learning what is unique about these places, what is unique about their regulatory systems, how their systems fit into the global enterprise, how they don't fit in, how you can really make a difference in public health and make a difference for your company, I think would be a competence that a regulatory affairs professional is unique to bring to that discussion within their company.
Before we open up, if others have questions from the audience, I want to throw out one other concept to you, because we've talked about changing paradigms and development of new regulatory models. We've also talked about, Mac, as you just mentioned, these growing economies. They're going to create regulatory systems that are probably different from the large regulators today. We opened this conference with a speaker who talked about simplexity, taking very complex systems and simplifying them so that we can better understand them and use them. And regulation and regulatory agencies are a perfect example of complexity. But do we think these emerging economies creating these new regulatory systems may be able to create something that's more effective in the future? Will they be able to create something that is more simplistic? I'm not sure what but something that takes the real complexities of today and simplifies it based on their world. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a partial example, and that's what COFEPRIS in Mexico has done.
Yeah.
You know, they really stepped back and did a very thorough assessment of the queue, primarily of generic products and a lot of devices that were just not getting onto the market. So they looked at it holistically, from number of patients that were not able to be treated, the economic impact, financial impact it's having to distributors, manufacturers in their country, and they realized that the regulatory system couldn't keep up with it. So they did their homework and have now put in place a system of reliance, very similar to what Mac was talking about earlier, where they've identified select agencies whom they will follow. If that agency makes a positive decision about that product, they will rely on that agency's technical assessment. And they've also put in place a pre-validation system where they let third parties come in and pre-validate a device application or a manufacturing situation, so that they've lowered the burden of work they need to do in places where they feel it's the appropriate thing to do. Again, looking at that big picture, the public health need, the economic need of the country. So I wouldn't necessarily put Mexico in the low middle income countries that we've been talking about, because I think they definitely are really emerging, and they're part of the North American continent, so they get a lot of support from the United States and from Canada. But I think that's an example that we could hold up, that others could look at and try at least to learn from.
And I would even add, because I was going to say the same thing with COFEPRIS, there's another side to what Martha has talked, and that is by doing this reliance on products that were coming into their country, they were able to redirect their resources to oversee their own industry and to raise its standards, such that now many Central American countries are relying on them. So it's both a reliance on and putting yourself in a position to be relied upon by others that I think is the wonderful story of COFEPRIS as an example of how, with some really enlightened leadership, a country can kind of look at this and come out as the leaders down there will tell you, what they see as a win-win for their people, for their public health, and they actually explain it beautifully, both as good for public health and good for the economic health of Mexico. And so they see it as an incredible win-win from both of those.
And that is an excellent example. And as Mac, you said, this was really politically driven and economically, but looking at the public health and getting new products to market faster. And now it's playing out within, as you said, the Americas. So COFEPRIS has now got arrangements with El Salvador, with Guatemala, and so they're teaching how to strengthen these agencies within Central America. And COFEPRIS is one of 5 national reference agencies of regional reference under PAHO or WHO designation, where they've been assessed by the WHO or PAHO after a pre-assessment, and there's 4 stages, and they've reached the top stage. So you have 5 countries within the Americas that are at this point, and U.S. and Canada have thrown their hat into this and have undergone a self-assessment, and we'll get the results of that. But we're looking essentially now at 7 reference agencies within the Americas. So once you're at that level, the discussion now is, how can we leverage one another's efforts? And do I have to inspect in Colombia if Argentina has conducted an inspection? And so that's at the status right now. I think there's a number of different models where it could be unilateral acceptance against stringent regulatory agencies. But then when you're sort of at the same level, how can you, between yourselves, really leverage efforts? But how can you also help with the capacity and decisions of smaller agencies within your region? And so we're seeing these type of regulatory networks, variations on a theme that are really coming to the forefront in different regions in the world. And of course, Mac, you're intimately aware of or familiar with the East Africa Community Initiative. And coming back to your point, is there something that we can learn? I think even the most advanced regulatory authorities can learn from, let's say, East Africa experience. When I read this in the business case, it's fantastic. And, having a common information management system and some of the things that they're putting in place to really sustain this, we can definitely learn from that. So I think it's a two-way street here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John, any final comments on that?
Well, I was just thinking, actually, Mike is a little modest because he should be talking about all his initiatives in APEC as well, and that's, I think, moving things forward across the 21 economies. But I think the short answer to Sherry's question is yes, there definitely will be room for developing countries to try out new models, and I think the support needs to be there from the more established regulators and systems. But as I said earlier, I think the global mood is a lot more open to this than it was before. And so that gives me great cause for optimism as well in moving forward. I think just the final point, because to touch on regulatory professionals, the aspirational element must be there, not just in terms of moving the systems forward, but your tagline of RAPS, regulatory excellence, is critical. And while you need to define what exactly you're talking about, that needs to be an aspiration for every regulatory professional, whether within an agency, within a company, because, and I made this comment at the RAPS evening in Singapore, that I think it's everything, it means everything, because that gives legitimacy and credibility to an area that has come under a lot of knocks, I think, in recent years. But if everyone is aiming for regulatory excellence, that really builds up that credibility and gives that platform again to assert the profession as well as the systems that will move forward for better public health, I think, globally.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just one other comment to add on what John said as well. And this is, again, coming back to APEC initiative, where we are actually looking at the Regulatory Center of Excellence as one of a number of centers of excellence in a virtual network that would help sustain and complement these activities. But you really have to hit it at different levels. So at the level of science, so regulatory science, and the technical level, how do you review multi-regional clinical trial? But you also have to hit it at the policy level. And that's where, being an enabler through the Regulatory Center of Excellence, potentially through RAPS as a neutral convener, where you get the people who make the decisions and write the policies and develop the regulatory frameworks have to be involved. Because you could say at the science level, at the agency level, yeah, I get that, a region with 100 patients, that scientifically doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's laws that say that we have to do this. So you have to be able to hit this at more than one level if you're going to drive this type of change, to have smarter regulatory systems. But even some of the largest countries in the world, time and again, China said, we are eager to hear how you're approaching this. They are now involved in ICH. They are a full member of the IAM-DRF Management Committee. Same thing with Brazil, making tremendous advancements in certain areas. And I think really you have to have a multi-pronged approach to this.
Any final comments from any other panel members that you'd like to add?
No,
I just would like to go to the example that Martha mentioned that we might, because I think it's kind of a good example to bring us back to what we aspire to and what the realities are that hit us sometimes. As many of you know, in the last year and a half, the first new drug for tuberculosis was authorized here in the United States and in the European Union. Now, in both of those jurisdictions, tuberculosis basically qualifies as an orphan kind of indication. In other parts of the world, it's not orphan. It's a major public health issue. But when you look at how the FDA authorized that product and how the European Union authorized it, FDA authorized it using the accelerated approval approach, and the European Union authorized it using the conditional authorization approach, both of which made infinite sense within the context of those two countries who have the back-end piece to make those kinds of front-end regulatory approaches work, because they have the systems to make sure that the right people get it and that there is appropriate pharmacovigilance. And some of the questions that were not answered or new questions that came up from the clinical trials could be answered. But now we have the situation in many low and middle income countries where they hear about this new great drug for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and WHO has this, and the question is, how could you begin to think about authorizing this based on what the FDA and the EMA did when in many of these countries you don't have the back-end piece? You know, it simply does not exist. You don't have the infrastructure to use these products in the way that FDA and EMA said within their jurisdiction you had to use them in order for the benefits to outweigh the risks. And so it creates an incredible dichotomy of, you know, yes, when can you rely on someone, when can you not rely on someone? And I think for you all, as you're developing your products that have applicability both within high-income countries and within low- and middle-income countries, there is this back-end piece. And as I think we get more and more in the high-income countries to thinking about regulation as a life cycle regulation, and that it's not just this magic moment in time where, you know, you're either not approved or approved, but it's an approval because other things are going to continue to happen. When you're dealing with countries that don't have the infrastructure to make these other things happen so that the products can be used safely and effectively, it creates another challenge, I think, to all of us when we're talking about regulatory convergence.
And I think that's a wonderful way to bring a very specific focus back to a challenging issue. And we could probably go on for a long time, but we're reaching the noon hour, and I think that many people have planes to catch. But this is a conversation that we need to continue to have. We can have it virtually. We can have it in various forums. And I think it's something that RAPS will continue to host. Centers like John's in Singapore will continue to host. It's an important challenge that lies ahead. And I think, John, when you reference driving regulatory excellence, however we define that, it is a critical need. Whether we sit in industry, regulatory agencies, academic, clinical environments, our mission is to improve public health and to do that well. And many, many challenges ahead. Many challenges as we look globally, many challenges with changing paradigms. So this is not a job or a profession that's going away. No. It's one where we need to continue to learn, as Mike alluded to. We're not going to have time for any questions for the audience, but we will find a way to continue these discussions online and for you to, in fact, post comments and questions. And this will be a theme that we will look forward to continuing throughout this year and even bringing forth to Baltimore next year. Again, I really want to thank our distinguished panel here this morning. It was fascinating to hear their perspectives. And I wish you all very, very safe travels. We look forward to seeing you in Baltimore, and we look forward to hearing from you throughout the year. Thank you very much for being here. Good morning.